Um, so as you heard earlier in the introduction, my name is Elizabeth Mayer, and I'm the Preservation Librarian for the Houston Metropolitan Research Center. We just got done learning from Joy and Sue over at Clayton about some of the scrapbooks that are housed at Clayton and some scrapbooking resources that are available online, along with the criteria for donating scrapbooks to institutions. I'm now going to be discussing all the preservation challenges that come with taking care of historic scrapbooks and family scrapbooks, and the ways in which you can take care of your family keepsakes. I'm also going to be going into different options for creating scrapbooks that can last for a much longer time. So scrapbooks can be a really unique and difficult preservation challenge. The very nature of a scrapbook makes it really difficult to maintain the longevity for each individual component. Librarians and archivists often face the challenge of keeping a scrapbook preserved and keeping it preserved to such a degree that it is still very usable for researchers. So scrapbooks are incredibly susceptible to all of the very same environmental factors that can affect other book and paper collections. These factors include temperature, humidity, water, fire, light, pests like insects and rodents. What each of these environmental factors have in common is time. Time will naturally start to age collections, especially scrapbooks, and it makes them more susceptible to environmental factors. And likewise, the more time spent exposed to environmental factors, the faster that these materials will start to age naturally. It's a very cyclical relationship. The reason why these environmental factors are so critical to scrapbooks is that the very construction of a scrapbook can make it weak to the elements or likely to deteriorate a lot faster than other materials. When librarians and archivists are speaking about a natural part of a historic item or other materials and having it vulnerable to age and time, we refer to this as inherent vice. An inherent vice is what causes the deterioration of an item due to an internal instability rather than any external factor. However, these external factors, such as humidity and temperature, could impact and increase the natural internal instability of an item. So understanding the inherent vice of an object is important. So for this portion of the presentation, I'm going to be going over all the different parts of a scrapbook, along with their various strengths and weaknesses, to cover why each of the scrapbook components end up kind of working against each other over time. So altogether, Scrapbook is made of a series of bound papers with a variety of materials, including papers, photographs, textiles, and other three-dimensional objects, which are attached to support materials. These components are attached to the papers with a variety of adhesives, including tape and glue. I'm going to be starting our look into the parts of a scrapbook by looking at binding styles. Scrapbooks can come in a variety of shapes and sizes and styles, and some scrapbooks are sewn together, oftentimes looking like a standard case-bound hardcover book, whereas others might be a little bit more loosely collected and maybe tied together with a single cord that's through the front and back cover, such as in this example here, or by piercing the entire scrapbook with metal posts. The binding styles of a scrapbook could cause a variety of preservation challenges. Scrapbooks that are bound like standard case-bound books, they might be more secure and might hold together better, but this also means that the binding is very tight. And if the pages themselves are really acidic, then too tight of a binding could cause the pages to break apart. If a scrapbook is bound loosely with the cord or a twine, this might allow the book to lay open flat, which could be great for being able to read the scrapbook or access it easier for editing. But over time, it might begin to fray and age. The page could start to become loose, and that can start to fall apart. And for metal posts, that might be a pretty strong and secure binding, but it also makes the pages vulnerable to any kind of rust damage that can happen to the metal binding, because the rust will then spread onto the pages, and that's more or less a permanent damage on the paper. Next, I'm going to be talking about support materials. So while most scrapbooks use paper as a support material, there are other support material options available. The other types of pages that are most likely to be found in family scrapbooks would be magnetic or self-adhesive pages. These were quite popular for scrapbooks and photo albums in the latter half of the 1900s. The paper that's used for scrapbooks, it comes in a variety of sizes, colors, thicknesses, and strength. So often for scrapbooks that might contain heavier contents, like a cardstock or a heavier weight paper might be used. A lot of older scrapbooks in the HMRC collections will use like a black paper that looks and feels very similar to a construction paper and might have been around that same thickness, like in the example photo that you see here. So as paper starts to age, it naturally becomes more acidic and brittle over time. This starts to change the color of the paper. It makes it a lot more susceptible to breaking apart. And additionally, paper that was made around the mid-1900s, where like 1940s through the 1980s, are incredibly acidic, and they break down at a really fast rate, just due to how acidic the paper was. This was kind of due to the way it was processed at the time and how quickly they were trying to make the paper. So that paper has a lot of inherent vice to it. Now, for magnetic or self-adhesive pages, these pages are really bad for photographs and other materials, because not only are they also acidic and could damage your materials, despite being marketed as being able to put on or remove items very easily, they could adhere to your materials too strong, and that can cause a lot of damage if you're trying to move photographs or other papers around. In order to attach all the items that are on display in scrapbooks, a variety of different adhesives are used. Different types of glue are probably some of the most common types of adhesives. These include like Elmer's glue, glue sticks, rubber cement. These are often used to attach papers, photographs, and other items, and they're marketed as being able to attach things without leaving a visible mark behind. Tape is also frequently used, like Scotch tape or masking tape. And there are also options for self-adhesive photo corners and other decorative attachments meant to just kind of help design the page and add little decorative embellishments. Many of these attachment methods are unfortunately inherently harmful to the longevity of a scrapbook. All of the glues that I mentioned above are inherently acidic to some degree. Some, like Elmer's glue, might be just a little bit acidic, but over time it will start to age. It'll start to darken and get a little bit brittle over time. This will start to degrade both the support paper and the material that is being held on display on the page. A lot of historic scrapbooks that we have in our collections have these very visible stains throughout the book from degraded glue, and oftentimes these are weak spots where the paper could easily break. Now for tape, Scotch tape and other pressure-sensitive tapes are not only very acidic, but the plastic parts of the tape and the adhesive will both start to break down over time. There's a type of deterioration called adhesive creep, where the thin glue layer that's underneath the tape will begin to spread outward. And this could put the pages of your scrapbook at risk from being stuck together. Scrapbooks can be made for a really wide variety of reasons. So some of these could be meant for preserving family memories. They could be meant for recording the history of a business or a city department, or even like a nonprofit organization. So the contents of a scrapbook can vary quite wildly. They will oftentimes include newspaper clippings or other photographs, but other ephemeral items like tickets, programs, cards, letters, ribbons, other textiles, even in some cases hair or other organic material, these can all be included in scrapbooks. So because of the variety of materials that are attached, each of these materials has their own inherent rate of deterioration, and their own strengths and weaknesses. The overall effect, though, is that when they're placed in close proximity with each other, they'll increase the rate of deterioration for each item. So to give a really specific example, if you are putting photographs on a page next to or even adjacent to a page with maybe just a letter or another paper material, what this can cause is as the photograph starts to break down, it'll leave a relief image in the photograph. So you'll have this faded stain on your papers that's an exact mirror image of the photograph that is now also starting to break down. So when you're trying to construct a scrapbook, knowing which types of materials are going to be placed next to each other is going to be really important. So with all of these components that are being taken into account together, every aspect of the construction of the scrapbook could negatively impact each other component. However, even with these challenges, it is possible to preserve historic scrapbooks and to keep these family keepsakes in really good condition over time. So for the next part of this presentation, I'm going to be covering the ways that we can counteract the inherent vice of a scrapbook and keep it in decent condition over time. One of the ways to help preserve historic scrapbooks is to prevent some of the more unstable materials from touching each other. Interleaving pages with acid-free paper or acid-free tissue paper can help keep each page separate and keep the materials from affecting the rate of deterioration for each other. If you're shopping for acid-free interleaving materials, you may have a choice between using buffered or unbuffered paper. Buffered paper is called that because it has an extra alkaline coating, which helps keep it from becoming acidic over time. This can be really helpful if you have acidic papers that you want to keep from turning your interleaving materials acidic. However, you don't necessarily want to use buffered paper on photographic materials because that alkaline coating can negatively affect the emulsion layer of the photograph. So you would want to use specifically unbuffered or just completely acid neutral paper if you have any photographs in your scrapbook. Another option for particularly problematic or fragile scrapbooks is to disbind them from their original binding. By taking scrapbook pages out of their original binding, this could allow the pages to completely rest flat, or even be able to place them in protective enclosures like boxes or folders. The pages will still be accessible, but by disbinding, the pages would no longer be vulnerable to the breakdown of the binding style over time. However, this is a process that should be done incredibly carefully and only when it's been decided that this is the best option for the long-term preservation of a scrapbook. If it's done quickly or without a lot of care, then disbinding can cause significant damages to the pages. So while it's a preservation option that can be very helpful in the long run, it can also cause a lot of physical damage to the paper, so it's important to be done either prior to the scrapbook becoming a little too unwieldy, or it's done with the utmost care and attention to detail. Once scrapbook pages are separated from each other, encapsulating the individual pages is also a possibility for preserving acidic or otherwise problematic materials. Encapsulation refers to housing papers, photographs, or other materials in a safe plastic enclosure that's either fully sealed on all four sides or only partially sealed to allow for access to the original item. It's really important when you're encapsulating to remember to use archival safe plastics. Some plastic sheets or plastic sleeves can start to break down over time and cause significant issues for materials in the plastic that the plastic is supposed to protect. For example, in some of H. Mercy's collections, there are scrapbooks that were already bound into plastic enclosures. However, the plastic that these enclosures were made of was incredibly acidic, and this led to, as you see in the photo here, the plastic expanding, warping, and eventually releasing an incredibly strong a smell that can be best described as rancid vinegar, which was incredibly unpleasant and took a long time. All the pages in the scrapbook had to be very carefully taken out of the plastic, aired out, flattened, and eventually stored in an archival safe box. So with that in mind, when it comes to finding archival safe plastics, it helps to remember the 3 Ps: polypropylene, polyethylene, and polyester. These are generally considered to be archival safe plastics to use, and some vendors will sell already made plastic sleeves made from these materials to allow for easier encapsulation. So one of the simpler and less invasive changes that you can make to your historic scrapbooks that would help for its long-term preservation would be to remove any harmful contaminants. So this could include tape, staples, pins, and other removable but damaging items. Now, it's important to note that, like I said earlier, some tape can't be removed without causing severe damage to the paper that it's on top of. So with that, it would be best to begin by removing paper clips and metal pins, as the rust from these materials can severely damage the paper they're meant to be holding in place. And once these are removed, the loose photos or papers can be housed in, say, a folder or an envelope so that they don't become lost from the original scrapbook. You can attempt to remove some of the tape, but if it doesn't start to lift away naturally on its own, if you can feel a lot of resistance, then oftentimes it would be best to just leave the tape in place, as sometimes the damage caused by removing that tape could be worse than the damage caused by having the tape remain in place. So in addition to some of these fairly significant preservation changes, I wanted to talk about just the differences and smaller changes that can be made for long-term preservation just by how you handle the item. So when handling older scrapbooks, it's really important to move slowly and carefully. Remember that each page of a scrapbook is weighed down with the additional weight of whatever items have been attached to the page. These can be anything from as light as newspaper clippings to as heavy as 3-dimensional objects. In this example photo here, we have an entire scrapbook that is filled with different examples of wax seals. So the pages actually are a lot heavier than other scrapbook pages might be. So when you're turning the pages in a scrapbook, it's really important to support the entire weight of each page as it's being turned. Because if you are trying to lift like a fragile or brittle page from just the edge of the page, this could result in either minor or even major tears or breakages in the paper. The final handling tip that I have is the same handling tip that I would give for working with any older or fragile book or paper materials, and that is not to force the scrapbook to lay open flat. The binding for some scrapbooks will allow it to naturally lay open flat, but that's not always going to be the case. Therefore, it's really important not to force that book open past the point that it physically is able to. So as you open the book, you might start to feel a natural resistance, and that's the point where you want to stop. So in some cases, libraries might even provide cushions such as these or other supports to help keep the book from being open too far and causing any breakages along the spine of the book. In the final section of my presentation today, I wanted to discuss some of the recommended do's and don'ts for making a long-lasting scrapbook. I'm going to be going over materials to avoid and what materials are recommended, as well as general tips and tricks for avoiding potential preservation issues. So one of the most important choices when you begin making your scrapbook is to choose what materials you're going to be using for your support pages. It's really important to avoid any acidic materials, or at the very least to know the risks of using inherently acidic paper. It's also important when you're shopping for paper that you might see the term archival being used by vendors to indicate, say, that a material might be long lasting or something like that. But archival does not always mean the same thing as acid free. So acid free is really the term that you want to be looking for when you're shopping for support materials. Now, some scrapbooks are already sold as pages that are housed in plastic sleeves. However, as I mentioned earlier in the section about encapsulation, non-archival safe plastic sleeves can be really problematic when binding your own scrapbooks. So it's very important to make sure that any plastics that are used for your scrapbook are safe for long-term use in order to avoid deterioration and vinegar syndrome. Additionally, as was discussed during the binding section, metal support structures can also cause a number of issues, both for the scrapbook itself and for any materials that are kind of housed next to or with the scrapbook, because as the metal of the binding begins to rust, that's going to start to speed up the deterioration of the paper, as well as start to deteriorate some of the other materials around it. In terms of support materials that would be best to use, it's really important to use specifically marked acid-free paper. The good news is that a lot of commercial vendors are making papers that are already acid-free or acid-neutral. So finding appropriate papers to use is actually a little bit easier these days. When you're choosing these support papers, it's also really important to consider the weight of the contents that you're going to be displaying on your scrapbook. If you're planning to include mostly newspaper clippings or other light paper materials, then a lighter weight paper would probably be sufficient and would be appropriate to use. However, if you're planning to use photographs or anything heavier than a photograph, then a thicker weight paper such as cardstock might be needed. It's also important, it's a really good idea to choose a binding style that's either not metal or is going to be unlikely to tarnish or rust if it is metal. It's also really good to keep the size and shape of your content in mind when you're choosing a binding style, so as not to choose a binding that might be overtaken by the content itself. When you're attaching content to your scrapbook pages, the adhesive or attachment method that you use could significantly impact the longevity of your scrapbook. So it's recommended to avoid most pressure-sensitive tapes, such as Scotch tape or masking tape, as these are going to start to break down over time. It's also recommended to avoid glue that would be higher on the pH scale. Like even Elmer's glue or glue sticks are slightly acidic, so they are going to start to discolor and deteriorate over time. A lot of adhesives and other similar products, they'll have their chemical information available online. You can look that up, and they would include what their pH number is. And so if their pH is a 6 or lower, that means it is acidic. If it's a 7 or higher, that means it's either completely acid neutral or it's slightly basic, so it's a little bit safer to use. It would be really helpful to also avoid any magnetic or self-adhesive pages, as these could potentially damage your materials over time. Staples, paper clips, metal pins, these are all attachment methods that you might want to avoid, as not only is there potential for rust damage, but the staples and pins can tear through and damage paper, and paper clips can start to leave like a lasting indentation in your paper. So thankfully, there are many options available for adhesives or attachments that are safer to use for making a long-lasting scrapbook. Although they are a weaker adhesive, there are some archival safe tapes that can be used, one of the examples being Filmoplast. There's also several pH neutral adhesives that are available, such as PVA or polyvinyl acetate. It looks and behaves similar to Elmer's glue because Elmer's glue is also made of a polyvinyl acetate, but these are specifically acid-free. There are also archival safe and water-soluble adhesives, such as wheat paste, rice paste, or methyl cellulose. Although for those, they will come in a powder form that you would then have to mix with water and either cook, or some can be mixed cold until a gel is formed. So that's something to keep in mind when you're purchasing these. Another way of using adhesives in a way that might not damage your materials is to only use your adhesive on, say, photo corners or other separate attachments that are used to maybe hold the item in place, but the adhesive isn't touching the item itself. That could be one way to help protect your scrapbook items and even make it so that they are eventually removable from the scrapbook itself. So finally, I'm going to be talking about a couple of general arrangement tips. The first tip is just to be aware of what materials are being used to support and decorate your scrapbook, as well as what materials are part of the content of the scrapbook. Like I talked about earlier, different types of materials can react in different ways when they're placed in close proximity with each other. So with that in mind, keeping photos away from non-photographic materials, or keeping inherently acidic materials away from other acidic materials, or items that are already kind of fragile, could really help increase the longevity of your scrapbook. My next recommendation is a little bit more subjective, and that's to avoid overcrowding the pages of your scrapbook. Too many materials on one page could start to wear the paper down and weaken it over time. My final suggestion is to consider using copies of photos for your scrapbook rather than using original photos for your content. A basic part of digital preservation is the motto, lots of copies keep stuff safe. The same can be true for maintaining physical collections. By making copies of your photographs, you would be able to have one copy for display and one copy to keep safe in its original form. So thank you again for coming in and participating in this Preservation Week presentation. If you have any questions regarding any of the collections and materials that we have at HMRC, please contact our reference department and we'd be more than happy to help. We, I think, are going to segue now into our question section. So if you have any questions for me or Joy or Sue, please feel free to use the chat and we'll try and answer as many questions as we can. Thank you again.
Mitch, got any questions in the?
Yes, we do. Thank you, Elizabeth. That was very informative, and Joy as well. Let me find my list of questions. Okay, so one of the questions that we had the two questions along the same lines, both from Leslie, asking about donating digitized copies of a scrapbook. What would be a good format? And then the other part of that question was whether you can donate such a scrapbook to Family Search.
So at this time, we aren't taking digitized images of scrapbooks. And you can send a digital image to Family Search. And if you email the library at cla.reference@houstontx.gov, I'll put that in the chat. And I can get you the link to donate a digital image and talk a little bit more to you about donating for us too.
Okay, okay. So Jamie W is asking a question. I guess this is going to be for Elizabeth. Do you recommend taking photos that are in those black paper scrapbooks out?
I think that could definitely be very helpful, especially if you say, for example, you consider the photos to be the most important part of that scrapbook to keep. If you're going to start to take apart your scrapbook, it might be really helpful to either take pictures of it, or if it's not too fragile, even making photocopies of it. Because if there's any information that might be written under, like anything about the photos that are on the page, that's going to be really important information that you want to keep, so that you don't have photos that end up losing their context over time.
Okay, you go and turn your camera on. Let's see.
Oops, sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. Okay, so we have questions. What are you trying to, excuse me, let me read this again. If this is from Valeria, if we are trying to attach something to our scrapbook, what do you think would be the best option? So what's the best way to attach things in a scrapbook?
That is a very tricky question. I think it's really going to depend on what you're trying to attach, because heavier items might need a stronger adhesive to attach it. I do think acid-free PVA is just, it's probably like a really good standard adhesive to use. It behaves really similarly to Elmer's glue. It doesn't really leave a mark behind, but it is stronger, so you're not going to really be able to take any of your scrapbook items off quite as easily if you're using something that might be dissolvable in water, like wheat paste or rice paste. So if you're thinking you might want to be able to take those items out of the scrapbook at a later time, those might be something you want to go with. So it's really going to be dependent on what you're trying to keep in your scrapbook and how long you want to keep it there for.
Well, let me ask you this. So when you're making a scrapbook, do you go in with the idea that it's either going to be permanent or temporary?
I think that would be definitely something to keep in mind. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And we had a couple of questions of people asking you to repeat the 3 Ps that you gave.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. No, those can be, so it's polypropylene, polyethylene, and polyester. If you want, I can actually type those into the chat, because sometimes spelling is...
Sure, that'd be great. That'd be great.
Yeah,
okay. Okay. So I'll move on to another question. Let's see. So do you recommend any online service or programs for making a digital scrapbook? Not necessarily for digitizing a physical scrapbook, but for something where you can create a scrapbook from digital beginnings. Your mic's off. Elizabeth, you there?
Oh, I'm very sorry. That question was, could you repeat the question?
Oh, sure, yeah. Oh, sure. I guess Joy can jump in too here if she wants. What online service would you recommend for beginning a digital scrapbook? Not necessarily a digitizing service, but one where you would start digitally making the scrapbook?
When you would start digitally? I will be honest, I am not as familiar with what services are going to be available for creating born digital scrapbooks. Sue, do you have any?
No, I think of like, Shutterfly and things like that. I mean, if, where you're gonna create that scrapbook, but no, I don't.
And
I'll
also,
just say,
looking,
go ahead, Joy.
in that example I gave for Cindy's list, there is a digital scrapbooking category. So check that out and see what websites they recommend.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. There's also, I think, Ancestry has been partnered with, I think, Canvas or something like that for a long time, and you can take the documents that you find on Ancestry and you can move them into the Canvas program, and you can create scrapbook pages. They used to do that. I haven't looked at it in a while, but you could create some very nice pages that way and print them out. But of course, it also offers a printing service as well. So I have a couple people asking about reputable suppliers for scrapbooking materials. Since it is important to get the right kind, you want a company that's reputable. And then a specific question about where to find an archival box.
So in terms of purchasing, say, archival strength materials, there are quite a few vendors online. I know a lot of libraries and archives will use places such as Gaylord Archival, University Products, Talus. These are all vendors that have been used in the past. Then they sell archival boxes and archival papers, as well as safer adhesives to use. Honestly, though, even because of, I guess, an increase in being able to produce already acid-free paper and material, even places like office supply stores or art supply stores, they can also sell archival safe materials. So what's really important is to look into, I guess, the product specs of what you're looking to purchase. And that's usually information that can be found by vendors online.
Okay, and going in the other direction, Gail is asking if the cooking or paper baking sheets, if they're acid-free, are they safe to use as page coverings? Do you know? I guess the paper that you use for cooking.
So, like parchment paper or
That's what it
wax
sounds like, yeah.
Huh. I will be honest, I haven't really considered using those as scrapbooking materials. We have used things like parchment paper or wax paper. Actually, in the lab here, we use that as actually a safe release paper. So if you're actually in the process of gluing anything down, if you want to make sure that you don't, accidentally stick your pages to each other, that's actually a really helpful and safe source for, keeping those pages separate from the glue as it dries.
Okay.
But in terms of covering materials for scrapbooks, no, I hadn't thought of using it in that way before.
Okay. We've had requests if you could mention the suppliers again.
Sure. So some of the, I think I see in the chat, they're asking me to also type it into the chat, so I'll type as I talk, but Gaylord Archival, University Products, Talus, that's I think more of a brand name rather than a larger vendor, but that's something to keep in mind. I will also say, like I said, we have purchased products for here, and I've purchased products for doing conservation work from office supply stores and art supply stores. So I'll write those into.
Okay, and let me ask you, are there any commercial companies in Houston that specialize in the preservation of scrapbooks? That question comes from Valeria. I guess Valeria doesn't want to leave it to chance, use a commercial company to do that.
No, I completely understand. Off the top of my head, I won't be able to name any specific preservation vendors. However, there are several in Houston specifically. I don't know if I'd be able to say. If you look through, one good source would be going through the American Institute of Conservation. They have a searchable list of conservation professionals. You can search by area, putting in either your state or your zip code, and you'd be able to find some of the closest ones to you. This list will also make sure to mention what each person's specialty is. So if you're looking to preserve scrapbooks, I don't know if I've come across somebody who is like specifically trained in preserving scrapbooks, but there are people who are more trained in book and paper collections, which those would be who I recommend to go to for scrapbooks. There are also people who are specific for preserving photographic materials. So that would be a really helpful list to go look through.
Sure. Now I've got one more question, and really it's at the end, but it's also at the beginning. How can a person start their own scrapbook? Anybody?
I mean, it was interesting when Joy read, the things that we had in the collection, and it seemed like some of those were just written stories, like taking that trip and filling in. Some of you might have seen that social history presentation that I do, collecting things, I guess, from events that you use, that you go to. Joy, some of those that you had in the beginning, what were some of the other content of them? I mean, I guess, are you talking about, when you talk about starting a scrapbook, are you talking about going to buy the materials or what to put in them? I guess is maybe one of my questions. But
yeah, I have to confess, Sue, I'm not a scrapbooker, but I would think it would be like another genealogical project where you kind of want to decide, who, what, where, when. Are you focusing on a particular line of the family or a particular place? But or we have lots of books you can check out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, as Joy mentioned, the circulating books might give you an idea of how to narrow down. I mean, it's kind of like, I want to create a scrapbook. Well, what do you want to create a scrapbook about?
Yeah, I think that's important to have a theme of some kind if you can. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of like, I want to work on my family history. Who do you want to work on? Same type of thing, being focused. So
now, I don't have any other questions, so if you want to go ahead and wrap it up, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, everybody. So the next presentation that we're having is, there is the Houston Metropolitan Research Center presentation that it's on the 12th, Elizabeth. With the next presentation is the 12th. You want to talk about what that is?
I could talk a little bit about that. It is going to be the first in a new office hours series that I believe the presentation is going to be given by our photo archivist, Matt Richardson. He's going to be speaking about digital preservation. He may also be speaking a little bit more about Memory Lab, which is going to be an upcoming service that will be offered by HMRC for preserving digital content that you have.
And you can register for that just as you register for our presentations through the library website. We have May 14th, a firsthand look at crypto-Jewish research and sources with Jeannie Milgram. And then May 21st is tracing your indigenous roots in Northeast Mexico and Texas with John Schmall. So we love that you guys visit us, and we love to present for you. And so thank you once again for joining us, and we will see you soon. Remember, browsing starts May 11th. Bye, everybody.